Imagine a power so old it was already ancient when the gods were young, a power that doesn't choose its host. It infects them. It crawls into the empty spaces of a person's soul and asks one simple terrifying question: what would you do if there were no consequences at all? What would you do if every impulse you've ever swallowed, every desire you've ever buried out of shame or fear or basic human decency suddenly had a body, a face, a pair of hands to act it out with? Now imagine that power inside a baby, not a soldier, not a criminal, not some desperate, repressed office worker drowning in debt and rage and quiet humiliation. A baby, an infant with no fear, no filter, no understanding of right or wrong, no internal governor of any kind, just pure, chaotic, untamed DD, wrapped in baby fat and wrapped again in a onesie. Now give that infant the ability to bend reality itself. Give it strength that can crater a hallway, twist steel, send furniture flying like leaves in a hurricane. Give it a face that can stretch and warp into anything its imagination conjures, a body that ignores gravity the second it gets bored of obeying it. What you'd have is a being that shouldn't exist, a creature that human civilization, frankly, isn't built to survive. We've built our entire world, our laws, our parenting books, our child-proof cabinets and outlet covers dot on the assumption that babies are at least physically limited. Loud, yes. Exhausting, yes. But limited. Contained by their own helplessness. Take that helplessness away. Replace it with God tier chaos magic. And then put it in the one place none of us are ever fully prepared for it. A quiet, ordinary house on a quiet, ordinary street in a quiet, ordinary American suburb that looks exactly like every other house on the block. A man is about to come home from a long day at a job he doesn't even like that much, rub his eyes, drop his keys on the counter, and find that exact nightmare sitting in his living room, giggling. This is the story of a father who is about to lose his mind, not in a metaphorical sitcom dad, pull your hair out kind of way. I mean that his sanity is going to be physically, supernaturally pried apart, piece by piece, by his own son, by the very thing he made, by the consequence of one reckless night he doesn't even remember. And stick with me here, because what happened behind the scenes of this movie is almost as wild, almost as chaotic as what happens inside it. A sequel nobody quite asked for. A movie built around the absence of the very actor who made the original a phenomenon. A film that would go on to become one of the most quietly infamous follow ups in the history of studio comedy. So strange, so divisive, so genuinely unhinged in its execution that it spent more than 2 decades being whispered about, sometimes in horror, sometimes in confusion, and increasingly in a strange growing pocket of the internet, in something that looks suspiciously like affection. This is Son of the Mask, and by the time we are done tonight, you are going to understand exactly why this movie became a legend for all the wrong reasons, and maybe, just maybe, for a few of the right ones too. Let's rewind the clock for a second, because you genuinely cannot understand why this film hit theaters the way it did without understanding the shadow it was always going to live under. Back in 1994, a movie called The Mask exploded into theaters and turned a then rising comedian named Jim Carrey into an instant can't miss A-list superstar. Carrey played Stanley Ipkiss, a meek, lonely, perpetually overlooked bank clerk who stumbles onto an ancient wooden mask in a junk shop, a relic tied, as we'd later learn, to the Norse trickster god Loki. And the moment he puts it on, he transforms. Green skin, wild, oversized grin, pure animated reality bending chaos, given a body, given freedom, given permission to do every single thing the real Stanley Ipkiss was too scared, too polite, too repressed to ever do. The movie was a sensation. It had cartoon physics colliding head on with live action filmmaking in a way audiences genuinely hadn't experienced before. Tech Savory style visual gags executed with then state of the art digital effects wrapped around a surprisingly sweet, almost melancholy story about a lonely man finally feeling powerful, finally feeling seen. It made nearly $352 million worldwide on a relatively modest budget. It launched Cameron Diaz into stardom in her very first film role. It became almost overnight a permanent fixture of 90s pop culture, quoted, referenced, parodied, beloved. So naturally, and this is just how the industry works. Hollywood wanted more, but here's where the story gets complicated. And honestly, if you're a fan of the original more than a little bittersweet, Jim Carrey didn't come back. New Line Cinema spent years, plural, years developing some kind of follow up, and at various points, Carey himself was reportedly in talks to return to the role that made him a household name. But scheduling conflicts piled up. His career had exploded into an entirely different stratosphere by the early 2000s. He was doing Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. He was doing prestige dramatic work. He was a different actor at a different stage of his life. And there are persistent reports of a real reluctance on his part to step backward into broad green face slapstick at that exact moment in his career. whatever the precise reasons, the result was the same. Years of development limped along without its leading man. Then someone made a decision that, on paper, almost sounds reasonable, almost sounds like clever lateral thinking. If you can't bring back Stanley Ipkiss, why not sidestep the entire problem? Why not build the new movie around a completely different character? And if the mask itself is this ancient, cursed, godlike artifact capable of transferring its chaotic power into whoever wears it, what if this time that power ended up inside a child? That's the premise. That's the entire engine driving the next 90 minutes of this film. And once you understand that mask is going to end up quite literally slapped onto an infant, you start to understand exactly how strange this story was always going to get. The director's chair went to Lawrence Guterman, a filmmaker who'd previously helmed the animated feature Cats and Dogs, someone who clearly understood cartoon logic and exaggerated physical comedy from an animation perspective, but who was now being asked to translate that sensibility into a live action family film featuring a CGI infant. The screenplay bounced through multiple credited and uncredited writers along the way, a sign in itself of a production searching for an identity it never fully locked down. And in the lead role, not as the mask wearer this time around, but as the increasingly desperate, increasingly sleep deprived father trying to survive his own household. The studio cast Jamie Kennedy, a comedian known at the time for Scream and for Malibu's Most Wanted, suddenly tasked with carrying a major studio release while sharing the bulk of his screen time with a CGI baby capable of cartoonish, superhuman destruction, released on February 18th, 2005. Son of the Mask arrived in theaters with a target painted on its back before a single ticket was ever sold. Critics were primed, cocked and ready to measure it against a beloved decade-old original. Audiences walked in already asking the one question that mattered more than any plot detail: where on earth is Jim Carrey? And the box office numbers tell that story bluntly, without much room for spin. Made on a reported budget north of $84 million, the film brought in roughly $59 million worldwide. That is, by almost any conventional measure you'd want to use, a financial failure. Critics tore into it without mercy. It currently sits with a brutally low single digit percentage score on Rotten Tomatoes. The kind of number that follows a movie around for the rest of its existence like a ghost rattling its chains, mentioned in every retrospective, every worst sequels of all time listicle. Every conversation about Jim Carrey's career that somehow always finds its way back to the movie he chose not to be in. But here's the thing about ghosts. If you're patient with them, if you actually sit down and listen instead of running from the room, sometimes they have something genuinely interesting to tell you. Because what Son of the Mask actually is, once you strip away 2 decades of accumulated mockery, once you stop measuring it line by line against a beloved 90s classic it was never going to outrun, is something far stranger and more singular than most critics in 2005 were willing to give it credit for. It's unhinged in a way that very few studio family films from that era dared to be. It's tonally chaotic, swinging wildly between horror adjacent dread and broad slapstick within the space of a single scene. And it is at its core a movie that genuinely doesn't seem to know whether it wants to be a film, a live action cartoon, or an extended surreal fever dream about the sheer terror of new parenthood. And that confusion, that lack of a settled identity, is exactly where this story starts to get interesting if you are willing to look for it. So let's step inside it together. Let's go scene by scene, beat by beat, moment by moment, and actually look at what's happening on screen underneath all the noise. Because buried in this much maligned CGI fever dream, there's a real story about fear, about jealousy, about the terrifying loss of control that comes hand in hand with fatherhood. You just have to be willing to dig for it. The film doesn't open with our human characters at all. It opens somewhere else entirely, up in the cold mythic realm of the gods. We meet Loki, the trickster god of Norse mythology, voiced with theatrical, gleefully mischievous energy by Alan Cumming. Loki is a god without a country. He's been banished by his own father, Odin, for his endless, escalating pranks and chaos, and sentenced to wander the mortal world wearing the very mask that grants him his power. The same wooden mask that centuries later will end up forgotten in a junk shop, find its way onto Stanley Ipkiss's face, and eventually, after passing through hands and decades and entire lifetimes, land in the unlikeliest place of all. This opening matters far more than it first appears to. It isn't just mythological window dressing tacked on to justify a fantasy sequel. It's the film quietly telling you right at the start what this story is actually about underneath the slapstick. Loki is chaos without consequence. Loki is the living embodiment of impulse, mischief, and unchecked desire, a being who acts entirely on instinct with zero regard for the wreckage left in his wake. Does that sound familiar? It should. because that description doesn't just belong to a centuries old Norse trickster god. It also almost word for word describes a toddler. The film draws this connection more literally than you might expect going in. Loki, after his long exile, finally gets summoned home by Odin, but only on the condition that he first reclaims the mask. And the only way for that to happen is for the mask's power to make its way back across the centuries through Stanley Ipkiss's brief transformative ownership of it and eventually impossibly into the orbit of an unsuspecting infant who hasn't even been born yet. This is where we meet our human story and where the real engine of the film starts turning. Jamie Kennedy plays Tim Avery, an animator working at a studio that dot in a small, quietly clever detail the film never draws explicit attention to. Produces cartoons strikingly similar in tone and exaggerated visual style to the chaotic rubber limbed world of the mask itself. Tim spends his entire working life drawing manic, over the top animate characters purely for the entertainment of other people's children, while his own home life sits frozen in place, stalled, waiting indefinitely for him to finally grow up and step into the next chapter of his life. His wife, Tonya, played by Trailer Howard, wants a baby. She's ready. She's been ready, you sense, for a while now. Tim, and this is the detail that matters most. Dot does not want a baby. Or more accurately, Tim is genuinely deeply terrified of the idea. He is not ready, not in any way he can articulate out loud to his wife without sounding like a coward. He doesn't feel like a man capable of handling the responsibility of an actual human life because some unspoken part of him still feels like a child himself, still feels like he hasn't finished becoming whoever he's supposed to be. And right there, in that very first emotional beat of the film, before a single drop of CGI chaos hits the screen, the movie hands you its actual theme on a silver platter. Even if the marketing department and frankly most of the critics at the time never seemed to notice it was there at all. This isn't really deep down a movie about a magic mask. It's a movie about the paralyzing, suffocating fear of becoming a father. It's about a man who feels fundamentally unprepared, fundamentally unworthy, quietly terrified that he is going to fail at the single job in his life that actually permanently matters, and then the universe, in the cruelest, most chaotic, most over the top way imaginable, forces him to confront that exact fear head on by handing him a son with literal reality warping superpowers he has absolutely no idea how to control. Every parent watching this movie, underneath the slapstick, uh, Underneath the rubbery CGI baby chaos, underneath the mythological detour into Norse gods, is watching an exaggerated, surreal, funhouse mirror version of their own private anxiety. What if I can't handle this? What if my child turns out to be more than I can manage? What if I lose total control of my own house, my own marriage, my own sense of self? The second this tiny new person walks through the door and never leaves.
That's a real fear. A universal one, recognizable to nearly every new parent who's ever lived. And this film, whether through genuine intention or happy accident, builds its entire horror, comedy structure right on top of that exact nerve. So here's where the chaos truly begins. One night, on a camping trip meant to repair some of the growing distance between Tim and Tanya. A trip where Tim is visibly, uncomfortably dragging his feet on the entire subject of having a child at all. Tim's dog, Otis, goes digging in the woods and unearths something buried beneath the dirt and pine needles. The mask. This is one of the film's most memorable, and frankly most bizarre, sequences, and it deserves a moment of real attention, because it's where the tone of the entire movie first crystallizes into something genuinely unexpected. Tim, alone in his tent after a tense, unresolved argument with Tanya, slips the mask onto his face almost as a joke. A flicker of drunken, lonely curiosity in the dark, the kind of small, meaningless, seeming decision that ends up rewriting an entire life. And the instant it touches his skin, he transforms. Green flesh. Wild, rolling eyes. Cartoon, physics chaos pouring out of every gesture, every step, every word. He becomes, for one single unforgettable night, exactly what Stanley Ipkiss became a decade earlier. Pure, uninhibited, consequence-free ID, given a body and let loose into the world. And in that state, in a haze of manic, masked, larger-than-life energy, he and Tanya conceive a child. Let that sit with you for a moment, because the film does not shy away from the implication at all. The baby who is about to terrorize this entire household isn't simply exposed to the mask's power sometime after he's born. He is conceived directly under its influence. He is, quite literally, by the strict internal logic of this film, the son of the mask. The title isn't clever wordplay layered on top of the plot. It's a description of biological fact within the story's own universe. This child is mythological chaos given a heartbeat before he even exists. When Tim wakes up the next morning, hungover and disoriented, he has no memory whatsoever of what happened. The mask itself is gone, lost somewhere out in the dark water of the woods, swallowed by the lake, sinking out of the story for now. And life, for a few quiet months afterward, seems to simply move on as normal. Until Tanya tells him she's pregnant. And here, almost imperceptibly at first, the dread starts to creep in underneath even the film's lighter, more comedic beats. Tim doesn't know what we, the audience, already know. He has no idea his son was conceived under the direct, magical influence of an ancient, reality-bending trickster god's mask. All he knows, in this moment, is that he's terrified. And that fear is about to be justified in ways absolutely no parenting book on earth could have prepared him for. The birth sequence in this film deserves its own dedicated stretch of conversation, because it's genuinely one of the strangest, boldest choices in early 2000s studio family filmmaking, and it rarely gets credit for how strange it actually is. Tanya goes into labor. Tim, already overwhelmed, already barely holding his composure together emotionally, is rushed frantically to the hospital. And what follows is a hallucinatory, almost surreal sequence in which Tim, gripped by pure, overwhelming panic, imagines himself transforming, imagines chaos erupting violently around the sterile delivery room, his private anxiety physically, visually manifesting itself in increasingly cartoonish, increasingly unsettling ways. It's worth pausing on this, because it's an unusual choice for a mainstream, PG-rated family comedy to make. This is a major studio release depicting its protagonist having a genuine, anxiety-fueled, hallucinatory breakdown inside a hospital delivery room. That's not a small, throwaway gag. It signals that somewhere underneath the slapstick marketing campaign, somebody involved in making this film was trying, in their own clumsy and over-the-top way, to depict real psychological terror. The specific, suffocating terror of impending fatherhood. Through the visual language of body horror and surreal physical comedy. The baby is born. They name him Alvy. And almost immediately, in small ways at first, then in escalating, undeniable ways, things start happening that should not be happening. Here is where the film fully commits to its premise, for better and for worse, and where you either find your footing in its specific rhythm or you bounce off it entirely and never quite get back on board. Alvy, we come to learn, inherited the mask's power directly in the womb. He is, quietly and then increasingly terrifyingly, a baby capable of reshaping the physical world around him purely through impulse and instinct, with absolutely zero understanding of consequence, danger, or restraint. Think for a moment about what that actually means dramatically, beat by beat. Every baby, in some sense, is already a tiny chaos engine. Every infant cries without warning, destroys without intention, demands without negotiation, operates entirely outside the logic of compromise. Parents already, commonly, describe the early months of infancy as a period defined by a near, total absence of control. This film simply takes that universal, exhausted, very human truth, and makes it literal. Alvy doesn't merely disrupt the household emotionally the way every newborn does. He can stretch his own body like rubber, summon objects out of nowhere, casually defy gravity, and warp the physical world around him, all the while giggling, because to him, none of it is malicious. To him, it's simply play. The film stages an extended, almost entirely dialogue-free sequence in which Tim is left alone with Alvy for the very first time, and the baby slowly, then rapidly, reveals his powers in escalating, increasingly chaotic ways. Turning ordinary household objects into impossible toys, levitating effortlessly above his crib, multiplying himself across the room, at one unforgettable point transforming the entire living room into something resembling a miniature war zone, built entirely out of his own unfiltered imagination. And Tim, exhausted, sleep-deprived, already deeply insecure about his own capacity to be a good father, has to somehow process the fact that his own infant son might be a literal, physical, supernatural threat to the house around him, all while still trying to maintain some thin illusion of a normal domestic life for the sake of his wife and his own fragile sanity. This is the stretch of the film that critics in 2005 struggled with most. And it's worth being honest about exactly why. The CGI baby. Animated using then cutting-edge, but by today's standards visibly dated, effects technology, creates an uncanny visual experience that some viewers find charming, in a manic, live-action, cartoon kind of way, and that others find genuinely unsettling, drifting close to horror movie territory without ever quite admitting that's where it's headed. There's a reason certain corners of the internet have, half-jokingly and half-sincerely, referred to Baby Alvy as one of the more disturbing visual creations to come out of mid-2000s studio filmmaking. His exaggerated expressions, his impossibly wide grins, his eyes that occasionally seem just slightly too alive, too aware. It creates a viewing experience that's genuinely hard to categorize cleanly. Is this supposed to be funny? Is this supposed to be frightening? The film itself never quite decides, scene to scene, and so the audience never quite gets to decide either. But here's an idea worth sitting with for a second, instead of rushing past it. Maybe that exact ambiguity is actually the point, whether the filmmakers consciously intended it that way or simply stumbled into it. Babies are uncanny. Genuinely. Newborns occupy a strange, liminal space in human perception. Familiar enough to register instantly as human, unpredictable enough in their movements and expressions to feel subtly alien at the same time. Every new parent has had that disorienting 3 a.m. moment, staring down into a crib, feeling something suspended exactly between overwhelming love and a primal, hard-to-name unease. Son of the Mask simply takes that universally recognizable feeling and turns the dial all the way up until that ambiguous emotional static becomes the entire visual and tonal texture of the film. One of the more surprisingly effective threads running through this movie is the relationship between Alvy and the family dog, Otis. Otis, established earlier in the film as the very animal who first dug up the mask out in the woods, becomes Alvy's primary antagonist throughout much of the film's midsection, and the dynamic the film builds between them plays almost exactly like a classic sibling rivalry, if one of the siblings happened to be capable of levitation and matter manipulation. There's a clever structural idea buried here, one that's smarter than the film generally gets credit for. Otis represents the previous center of attention inside the household, the beloved family pet who, before Alvy's arrival, soaked up the bulk of Tim and Tanya's affection without competition. Now, with the baby home, Otis is being pushed aside, growing jealous, defensive, increasingly desperate to reclaim his old place in the family's emotional hierarchy. Alvy, meanwhile, instinctively senses Otis as a kind of rival, and uses his powers, almost playfully, almost cruelly, in the careless, unthinking way toddlers can sometimes be cruel to pets without any real malice behind it, to torment him relentlessly throughout the house. It's Tom and Jerry logic transplanted directly into a domestic family drama, and when the film commits fully to that specific energy, letting these two largely non-verbal characters chase, trick, and physically torment each other through increasingly elaborate, increasingly inventive slapstick sequences, it's genuinely some of the most purely entertaining material in the entire movie. There's a sustained chase sequence through the house that's staged with real visual inventiveness, drawing very deliberately on the rubbery, cartoon, logic visual language that made the original Mask films so distinctive and so beloved in the first place. And underneath all that slapstick, there's something quietly, recognizably true happening as well. Anyone who has ever brought a new baby into a household that already had an established pet knows this exact emotional terrain intimately. The jealousy, the displacement, the strange, shifting triangulation of attention and affection that suddenly has to be renegotiated. The film exaggerates all of it into superhero, cartoon chaos, sure, but the emotional bones underneath the exaggeration are absolutely recognizable to anyone who's lived through it. While all of this domestic chaos is unfolding back at home, Tim's professional life is quietly becoming its own slow, building pressure cooker. Tim works for a man named Otto, played with deliberately deadpan, almost off-kilter comedic energy by Stephen Wright, in a performance that functions almost as a tonal counterweight to all the visual chaos happening elsewhere in the film. Otto runs the animation studio, and he's fixated, almost obsessively, on launching a major new animated property, putting enormous, unrelenting pressure on Tim, who is sleep-deprived, distracted, and increasingly desperate, to deliver creative work under a tightening, unforgiving deadline. This entire subplot exists to dramatize something nearly every working parent understands instinctively and exhaustingly: the impossible, unworkable math of trying to be fully present for your child while also trying to be fully present for your career, when both of those things are demanding everything you have to give, simultaneously, with absolutely no slack left over in the system. Tim is failing at both, slowly and visibly. He's exhausted at work because Alvy simply doesn't sleep on any recognizable schedule, sometimes levitating quietly in his crib at 3 in the morning while glowing faintly green, watched over by parents too tired and too frightened to do anything but stare. And he's failing at home because his mind is constantly somewhere else entirely, pulled away by impossible deadlines and a boss who has exactly zero patience left over for excuses, explanations, or the truth. It's a classic comedic structure, the protagonist stretched painfully thin between two unsustainable, competing demands, but the film commits to it with a sincerity that quietly elevates it slightly above pure, weightless slapstick. Tim genuinely, deeply loves his son. He is not a bad father in any meaningful sense. He is a terrified father, doing his absolute best inside a situation that would break almost anyone, magical baby powers notwithstanding entirely. Remember Loki? The trickster god from the film's opening, banished and increasingly desperate to reclaim the mask so he can finally return home to Asgard after centuries of exile? This is exactly where his storyline collides directly, irreversibly, with Tim's. Loki, sensing that the mask's power has resurfaced, now manifesting through baby Alvi rather than through the mask itself, which remains lost somewhere out in the woods, tracks the energy signature directly to Tim and Tanya's house. And this is the exact point where the film shifts gears, moving from domestic, chaos comedy into something closer to a genuine supernatural thriller, even if it remains thoroughly soaked in slapstick the entire way through. Loki, disguised in human form, smoothly insinuates himself into Tim's day-to-day life, posing initially as a kind of mentor, a kind of knowing ally, someone who seems to understand exactly what's happening to Tim's family when no one else possibly could. And for one brief, vulnerable moment, Tim, isolated, confused, drowning in a situation no parenting book could ever have prepared him for, actually trusts him. This is a genuinely clever structural beat, even if the film never fully develops it to its full potential. Tim is so starved for someone, anyone at all, to validate what he's secretly experiencing, to simply tell him that he isn't losing his mind, that his son really does have impossible, undeniable powers, that this entire nightmare is real and not some symptom of his own exhaustion and inadequacy as a new father, that he becomes willing to trust a total stranger who shows up offering exactly the answers he's been desperately craving in private. It's a quiet but real piece of psychological characterization, even buried inside a broad comedy. Desperation makes people dangerously vulnerable to manipulation. Tim's loneliness inside his own private crisis, his sense that he can't possibly tell anyone, can't possibly explain what's happening, can't say out loud to another adult my baby has superpowers without sounding completely insane, creates exactly the opening Loki needs to get close to him, to gain his trust, to position himself for what comes next. But Loki's motives, of course, are not benevolent in the slightest. He wants the power sleeping inside Alvi. He needs it back in order to finally go home. And as the film moves deeper into its back half, that hidden agenda starts surfacing, gradually transforming what had been a chaotic, slapstick-driven family comedy into something with actual, tangible stakes, a tug-of-war over a child's safety, dressed up in mythological clothing but unmistakably real underneath it. While Tim is slowly being pulled into Loki's orbit, his marriage to Tanya is fraying under an entirely different, more grounded kind of pressure. Tanya doesn't know anything about the mask. She has no idea what actually happened on that camping trip. All she knows, day to day, is that her husband seems increasingly distant, increasingly erratic, increasingly off, disappearing at strange hours, behaving strangely and evasively around their own son, apparently unable to keep up with the basic demands of new parenthood that she herself is also struggling to manage. There's something quietly painful buried inside this thread, even though the film never lingers on it long enough to fully earn the emotional weight it's reaching for. Tanya is a new mother juggling exhaustion, hormonal upheaval, and the disorienting, total identity shift that comes with having a child, and she's doing all of it while her husband, the person who is supposed to be standing beside her through exactly this, is increasingly absent, increasingly distracted, and clearly, visibly hiding something significant from her. It's a dynamic that mirrors real marital strain after a new baby arrives. The resentment that builds quietly when one partner feels like they're carrying the entire emotional weight of the household alone, the suspicion that creeps in when communication breaks down at precisely the moment a couple needs it most. The movie wraps all of this in supernatural absurdity, sure, but the underlying bones of it are recognizable to anyone who's ever watched a relationship strain and bend under the weight of new parenthood. The tension finally comes to a head when Tanya begins to suspect, without yet knowing the actual supernatural truth, that something is fundamentally wrong, both with her husband, and, in ways she can't quite name or articulate out loud, with her son. One of the film's most elaborate set pieces involves a babysitter left alone with Alvy, completely, utterly unaware of what she's about to walk into. What follows is an extended sequence of escalating supernatural slapstick, Alvy unleashing his powers in increasingly inventive, increasingly destructive ways while a terrified, bewildered young babysitter tries desperately to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that has, in every meaningful sense, broken the laws of physics around her. This sequence is, depending entirely on your personal tolerance for manic, sustained CGI chaos, either the film's comedic high point or its single most exhausting stretch. It's relentless. It's loud. It throws an enormous volume of visual gags at the audience in rapid, breathless succession, transformations stacked on impossible physical feats stacked on cartoon logic mayhem layered on top of even more cartoon logic mayhem. But there's something worth genuinely noting underneath all that noise. This entire sequence is staged almost entirely from the perspective of an outsider witnessing Alvy's powers for the very first time, without any context whatsoever, without any prior preparation. And her reaction, pure terror, pure disbelief, a total inability to process what she's witnessing, mirrors almost exactly what an audience member might be feeling watching this same kind of chaos unfold inside what's nominally being sold as a family film. The babysitter's fear becomes, in a strange and almost accidental way, a kind of stand-in for the audience's own disorientation in the theater seat. It's a sequence that demands a lot of patience from its viewers, tolerance for chaos, a willingness to simply surrender to the absurdity instead of fighting it the entire way through. Some audiences happily go along for that ride. Others check out entirely, somewhere around the halfway mark. There isn't really much of a comfortable middle ground available with a scene built like this one. Eventually, the pieces start coming together for Tim. Memories of that night out in the woods resurface, blurry at first, then sharper, more insistent. The truth about the mask, about Alvy's actual conception, about the dormant power sleeping inside his own son, it all clicks into place at once, and with it comes a wave of guilt that the film, to its credit, actually allows to land with some real emotional weight. Because here is the realization Tim now has to sit with, fully, for the first time: he did this. Not intentionally. Not with any knowledge of what he was setting into motion. But the chaos now consuming his family, the danger now actively circling his own son because of Loki's interest, all of it traces directly back to a single reckless, drunken decision Tim made before he was anywhere near ready to be a father at all. This is, narratively speaking, the film's single most mature beat. Tim's entire arc isn't really, underneath everything, about defeating a trickster god in some climactic battle. It's about taking full, honest ownership of the consequences of his own immaturity, about finally, completely, fully stepping into the role of father, not because he suddenly feels ready, not because his fear has magically evaporated, but because his son needs him to, right now, immediately, with absolutely no more room left for hesitation or denial. It's a classic hero's journey beat, sure, just filtered through baby, superpower slapstick instead of a more conventional dramatic frame. The man who spent the entire first act of this film terrified of fatherhood now has to become, by the climax, the one person standing between his own child and a god who wants to use him as nothing more than a vessel. As the film accelerates toward its climax, Loki's mask slips, both literally and figuratively. His patient, charming demeanor falls away all at once, revealing the manipulative, deeply self-serving trickster underneath it the entire time. He never cared about Tim's family. He never cared about Alvy as an actual person. He sees the child purely as a vessel, a container for power he desperately wants back inside himself, by absolutely any means necessary. This is where Alan Cumming's performance gets to truly shine, frankly. There's a theatrical menace he brings to Loki in these later scenes, a gleeful cruelty hiding just beneath centuries of cosmic boredom and accumulated resentment. He's a god who has spent so long in exile, so long denied his rightful home, that he's lost any real moral compass along the way. He will take what he needs from one small, ordinary human family without a second thought, because in his mind, they barely register as more significant than insects beneath his feet. And here is where the stakes finally, fully crystallize for the audience. This isn't simply a wacky, superpowered baby comedy anymore. This is a story about a parent who has to physically, literally fight a god in order to protect his child. The absurdist comedy of the first two acts gives way to something with genuine dramatic urgency, even if the actual execution remains steeped in CGI slapstick rather than traditional, grounded dramatic tension. The film's climax brings everyone together at once: Tim, Tanya, Alvi, Otis the dog, Loki, and eventually Odin himself, in an escalating, chaotic confrontation that blends the movie's two dominant, competing tones, horror-tinged supernatural stakes and manic cartoon slapstick, into one single extended sequence. Tim, having fully embraced his role as protector, now has to outwit a literal god using nothing more than his own wits, his love for his son, and, in a nice piece of thematic symmetry, some of the same creative, cartoon logic thinking that defines his entire job as an animator. The film draws a direct, deliberate line between Tim's professional skill set, his daily practice of imagining impossible, exaggerated cartoon scenarios for a living, and his sudden, urgent ability to survive and outmaneuver a reality-bending trickster god. His creativity, the very thing that made him feel inadequate and unfocused earlier in the story, becomes the exact tool that ultimately saves his family. That's a genuinely well-constructed piece of thematic architecture, even if the surrounding scenes don't always have the polish required to fully sell it to a skeptical audience. The film is quietly arguing, underneath all the chaos, that the very qualities which made Tim feel like an unready, immature father, his imagination, his playfulness, his stubborn refusal to fully harden into rigid adult seriousness, are exactly the qualities that make him capable of truly connecting with, understanding, and ultimately saving his extraordinary son. Odin eventually intervenes directly, and in the film's final mythological beat, cosmic order is restored. Loki is dealt with. The immediate threat to Alvi passes. And the mask itself, the very artifact that set this entire saga into motion back in 1994, is removed from the equation entirely, sealing Alvi's fate as a normal, if still clearly slightly unusual, baby boy. After all the chaos, the gods, the chases, the relentless CGI mayhem, the film ends on a deliberately small, intimate note. Tim, Tanya, and Alvi, finally safe, finally able to simply be a family without any supernatural interference hanging silently over their heads. It's a modest ending, maybe even an underwhelming one if you walked in expecting some massive, sweeping emotional climax. But there's something quietly fitting about it too. After 90 minutes of escalating absurdity, the film essentially says, the goal here was never really about defeating a god in some grand, operatic sense. The goal was always just this: a family, intact, safe, together, sitting in an ordinary living room, finally able to exhale for the first time in what feels like forever. Tim got exactly what he was so afraid he couldn't handle at the very start of the film. He became a father. Not a perfect one. Not an instantly confident one. But a real one, someone who showed up, who fought, who chose his son over his own fear, again and again, until the choosing simply became who he was. Let's slow down for a moment and actually look at the people underneath all this chaos, because there's more going on psychologically here than the film's reputation tends to suggest. Tim Avery is, at his core, a man caught in arrested development. His job, drawing manic, exaggerated cartoons for a living, is itself a kind of safe space for his own unprocessed impulses, a professional outlet for the chaotic, playful part of himself he's never fully integrated into adult responsibility. His fear of fatherhood isn't really, underneath it all, about babies specifically. It's about finality, about the looming sense that becoming a father means the permanent end of a certain kind of freedom, a certain permission to remain unfinished, unsettled, undecided about exactly who he is and who he's allowed to still become. When Alvy's powers manifest, the film forces Tim into an extreme, exaggerated version of every new parent's worst private fear, that the responsibility will simply be too much, that he will fundamentally, irreversibly fail at the one job that can never be undone once it's begun. His journey across the film is a journey from avoidance to ownership, and while the film tells this story primarily through slapstick rather than traditional drama, the emotional shape underneath it is sincere, and it holds up under scrutiny if you're willing to actually look for it. Tanya is underwritten, which is one of the film's genuine, undeniable weaknesses. She exists largely in relation to Tim's arc rather than possessing a fully realized arc of her own. But what is there on screen suggests a woman dealing with the universal disorientation of new motherhood, compounded by a husband who's emotionally checked out at exactly the wrong, most vulnerable moment. Her suspicion, her hurt, her growing emotional distance from Tim, these are recognizable beats, even if the film never gives them the room they would need to fully breathe. Alvy, despite being an infant, functions almost as the film's ID made completely literal, pure impulse, pure desire, utterly without malice but also utterly without restraint of any kind. He's not a villain. He's barely even a character in the traditional dramatic sense. He's a force of nature wearing an infant's face, and the film's horror, adjacent visual choices around him only reinforce that reading further. He represents everything overwhelming about new life, joyful, terrifying, uncontrollable, and ultimately, despite every chaotic thing he does throughout the film, deeply, undeniably lovable. Loki, meanwhile, functions as the externalized, weaponized version of that exact same chaotic energy Alvy represents, but stripped entirely of innocence. Where Alvy's chaos comes from a place of total moral blankness, simple ignorance of consequence, Loki's comes from genuine, calculated self-interest. He's chaos with clear intention behind it, and that distinction is precisely what makes him dangerous in a way that a baby, however powerful, fundamentally isn't and could never be. Strip away the slapstick, strip away the CGI baby, strip away the entire mythological detour into Norse gods and cosmic exile. And what you're left with is a movie about the terror of losing control over your own life the moment you become responsible for someone else's. The mask itself has always represented unleashed ID within this franchise, desire without restraint, impulse without consequence. In the original film, that was an empowering fantasy for a meek, overlooked man who'd spent his whole life feeling invisible. In this film, that exact same force becomes something else entirely, the literal, physical embodiment of why new parents so often feel like they're quietly losing their minds in those first exhausting months. Every wild, destructive thing Alvy does throughout this film is, on a purely symbolic level, just an exaggerated version of completely ordinary infant chaos, the sleepless nights, the unpredictable tantrums, the overwhelming sense that your house, your schedule, your entire previous sense of order has been quietly hijacked by a tiny, all-powerful tyrant who answers to absolutely no one and understands nothing whatsoever about consequence. The genius of the metaphor, even if the film itself never fully earns the credit it deserves for landing it, is that it's universally, instantly recognizable as true. Every parent has, at some private exhausted moment, looked at their screaming, chaos-generating infant and thought, even half-jokingly to themselves in the dark at 3 a.m, "This kid has unstoppable powers and I genuinely have no idea how to control him." This movie simply takes that exhausted, universal parental thought, and makes it literal, supernatural, and rendered in CGI for 90 straight minutes. There's also a quieter thread here about creativity and immaturity being two sides of the exact same coin. Tim's career as an animator, someone who spends his entire professional life imagining exaggerated, impossible scenarios for a living, initially seems to be evidence of his fundamental unreadiness for adult responsibility. But by the end of the film, that same imaginative flexibility becomes the very tool that saves his family from genuine harm. The film is quietly suggesting, underneath everything else, that playfulness and responsibility aren't actually opposites at all, that the parents who stay connected to their own sense of wonder and imagination might actually be better equipped to handle the chaos of raising a child than those who've sealed themselves off entirely into rigid, joyless seriousness. It's a genuinely nice thematic idea. The execution doesn't always do it full justice. But it's there, quietly, consistently, if you're willing to look for it instead of dismissing the whole film on sight. Let's talk for a moment about how this movie actually looks and feels as a piece of filmmaking, because the technical choices made here tell their own story about ambition colliding with limitation. The CGI work on Baby Alvy was, in its own narrow, specific way, groundbreaking for its time. Full-performance digital infant animation simply wasn't common in 2005, and the visual effects team essentially had to invent new techniques on the fly to make a baby's face stretch, distort, and transform with cartoon physics elasticity while still reading, at least most of the time, as recognizably infant-like to the audience. The results are admittedly uneven by today's standards, and there's a reason this particular baby has become a minor meme of unsettling mid-2000s CGI design, but the sheer ambition behind even attempting it deserves more credit than it usually receives in passing internet jokes. The film's overall visual language constantly tries to evoke the cartoon, physics energy of the original Mask, exaggerated motion, impossible transformations, a heightened, almost Looney Tunes sense of spatial logic where the rules of physical space simply don't apply the way they should. When it works, particularly in the extended Otis versus Alvy sequences, it genuinely captures something close to the original film's anarchic, joyful visual spirit. When it doesn't work, particularly in some of the more chaotic, effects, heavy set pieces toward the film's back half, it can feel cluttered, overlong, and visually exhausting, throwing so much constant movement and noise at the screen simultaneously that there's no room left over for the audience to actually process what's happening in any given moment. The sound design leans heavily into exaggerated cartoon sound effects, boings, whooshes, oversized comedic impacts, reinforcing the live-action, cartoon hybrid identity the film is reaching for throughout its entire runtime. The score, meanwhile, does perfectly competent work supporting the constant tonal whiplash between horror, adjacent tension and broad physical comedy, though it rarely rises to anything particularly memorable on its own as a standalone piece of music. Director Lawrence Guterman, arriving from a background in animation, clearly understood the visual logic of cartoon physics on a technical level, but translating that same logic into live-action family comedy proved to be a much harder balancing act than his purely animated work had ever required of him. The film's pacing suffers from this exact tension constantly throughout. Scenes that genuinely should be allowed to breathe instead get rushed past, while certain chaotic set pieces overstay their welcome considerably, running on well past the point where the comedic effectiveness has already peaked and started declining. Let's be honest and fair here, because that's really the only way to actually understand this film's strange, persistent legacy decades later. What works in this film, the central metaphor, fatherhood as a kind of supernatural loss of control, is genuinely clever, even if the film never explicitly articulates it in so many words. Jamie Kennedy, despite being an unconventional choice to anchor a major studio comedy of this scale, brings real, fully committed physical performance energy to scenes that demand he react convincingly to chaos no actor could ever have been fully prepared for. The Otis and Alvy rivalry provides some of the most purely entertaining slapstick in the entire film, channeling classic cartoon chase logic with real effectiveness. Alan Cummings' Loki brings a theatrical, gleeful menace to every single scene he appears in. And there's something genuinely worth respecting in a major studio film from this era being willing to get this strange, this fully committed to its own absurd premise, without ever fully backing away from the weirdness out of fear or caution. What doesn't work? The tonal inconsistency is real, and it's constant. The film swings wildly between horror, adjacent unease, broad slapstick, sincere domestic drama, and mythological fantasy without ever fully settling into one consistent identity it can call its own. Tanya's character is genuinely underwritten, robbing the film of emotional stakes that a stronger, more fully realized female lead could have easily provided. Several set pieces, particularly in the back half of the runtime, simply run too long, mistaking sheer volume and chaos for legitimate comedic escalation. And the absence of Jim Carrey, while not really the film's own fault, since he simply chose not to return, created an impossible shadow for the entire production to operate underneath from day one. Every single comparison to the original was always going to land unfavorably, and the film never quite manages to find a way to stand fully on its own separate identity, apart from that unavoidable shadow. If you're looking for cinematic cousins to place this film alongside, Son of the Mask sits in a strange, specific lineage next to other early 2000s effects, heavy family comedies that tried to blend live action performance with cartoon logic CGI chaos, films that were genuinely ambitious in their visual technique but frequently shaky in their overall tonal control. It shares some clear DNA with body swap comedies and supernatural, family, chaos films of that exact era, though it leans harder into outright visual strangeness than most of its direct contemporaries ever dared to. Here's the part of this story that I personally find the most genuinely fascinating. 20+ years later, Son of the Mask hasn't faded into the same forgotten void that swallows most critically reviled studio sequels almost completely. It persists. It keeps getting rediscovered, generation after generation of new viewers. It shows up constantly in so bad it's fascinating video essays, in horror, comedy retrospectives, in late-night conversations among people trying to articulate exactly why this specific movie left such a strange, lingering impression on them as kids who maybe caught it on cable at the wrong, formative age. And I genuinely think the reason for that staying power is simple. This movie committed, fully and without much hesitation, to something genuinely strange, and strangeness, even flawed, uneven, imperfect strangeness, tends to outlast safe mediocrity in our collective cultural memory far more often than we expect it to. A forgettable, competent, safe sequel would have completely vanished from public consciousness by now without a trace. But a movie this willing to put unsettling CGI baby horror directly inside a PG-rated studio family comedy? That sticks. That haunts people, in a weirdly affectionate, almost nostalgic way they can't quite explain to friends who haven't seen it. There's also a quieter, more sincere layer underneath this whole strange legend, the actual parents who watched this movie during the exhausted, overwhelmed early days of their own first child's life, and found something genuinely cathartic, even genuinely hilarious, in watching their own private, unspoken terror reflected straight back at them as literal, screen-filling supernatural chaos. So where does that leave us, at the end of all this? Son of the Mask is not a good movie, in any conventional, strictly critical sense of that phrase. Its tone is a mess from start to finish. Its pacing stumbles repeatedly. It lives permanently in the shadow of a beloved predecessor it was never realistically going to escape, no matter what choices it made along the way. The CGI baby will probably continue haunting corners of the internet for as long as the internet itself continues to exist.
But underneath all of that chaos, underneath the gods, the slapstick, the uncanny baby effects that everyone loves to mock, there's a real, human story quietly trying to get out the entire time. A story about a man terrified of fatherhood, forced by impossible, escalating circumstances to become exactly the father his son actually needed him to be. A story about the universal, exhausting, genuinely beautiful chaos of bringing new life into a home that will never, ever be quite the same again afterward. It's a flawed film. It's a strange film. But it's not an empty one, and that distinction matters more than its Rotten Tomatoes score will ever suggest. And maybe that's the most honest, most fair way to remember it now, not as a failed sequel desperately chasing a hit it could never realistically replicate, but as its own weird, singular artifact of mid-2000s studio ambition, swinging hard for something genuinely strange, and connecting, against the odds, just often enough to leave a real, lasting mark on the people who actually gave it a chance. Final rating, 4.5 out of 10. A fascinating mess, not a hidden masterpiece by any stretch, but absolutely worth watching at least once in your life, if only to finally understand exactly why people still, all these years later, can't quite stop talking about it. Before we close this out completely, I want to go back and sit inside a few specific moments a little longer, because some of these scenes deserve more than a passing mention, and there's texture here that gets lost if we move too fast. Let's go back to that camping trip for a second. Because there's more happening in that opening stretch than just plot mechanics. Notice the way the film frames the argument between Tim and Tanya before he ever puts the mask on. It's not a screaming match. It's not melodrama. It's quiet, almost mundane in its specificity, the kind of low-grade marital tension that builds up over months of one partner wanting something the other partner keeps gently, politely deflecting. Tanya isn't demanding. She's hopeful, and a little tired of being hopeful without getting anywhere. Tim isn't refusing outright. He's stalling, deflecting with humor, changing the subject, doing all the small evasive things people do when they're not ready to say the true, uncomfortable thing out loud. I don't think I can do this. I don't think I'm enough for this. That's a real conversation. Couples have that exact conversation, almost word for word, in tents and kitchens and cars all over the country every single day. The film doesn't dwell on it long, because it's got mythological gods and a magic mask waiting in the wings, but it plants something true in the soil before the absurdity takes over, and that's worth noticing. And then, alone in his tent, stewing in that unresolved tension, Tim finds the mask. Think about the psychology of that moment for a second. He's not happy. He's not relaxed. He's frustrated, a little defensive, maybe a little ashamed of his own hesitation, and very much alone with his thoughts in the dark. That's exactly the emotional state the mask seems to be drawn to throughout this entire franchise, not contentment, but suppression. Not joy, but something held back, something unexpressed, looking for a crack to escape through. When he puts it on, what comes out isn't just chaos for chaos's sake. It's release. It's every unspoken fear, every bit of performance anxiety about fatherhood, every flicker of resentment he hasn't let himself feel honestly, suddenly given full, uninhibited permission to exist out loud. The film stages this almost entirely as physical comedy, green skin and exaggerated dancing and manic energy, but underneath the gag reel, there's a man finally, briefly, letting go of every single thing he's been holding in. That's why the conception happens the way it does narratively. It's not random. The film is quietly telling you that this child was made in a moment of total emotional unleashing, total honesty stripped of its usual social filters, even if that honesty arrived wearing a ridiculous green cartoon face. There's something almost poetic buried in that, if you squint past the slapstick. Let's also spend a little more time with the hospital sequence, because I don't think we gave it quite enough room earlier. When Tim starts hallucinating in that delivery room, what exactly is he picturing? It's not just generic chaos. It's specifically chaos centered on his own inadequacy, his own body betraying him, his own inability to keep up with what's happening around him. The nurses move too fast. The room stretches and warps. Tanya's voice seems to come from impossibly far away even though she's right there beside him. This is panic given a visual language, the specific, suffocating panic of a man who has spent 9 months telling himself he'll figure it out eventually, only to realize, in the one moment that can't be postponed any further, that eventually has just become now, and he doesn't feel any more ready than he did the day he found out. Every new parent has some version of this memory, even without the supernatural flourishes. The moment in the hospital where the abstract idea of a baby suddenly becomes a real, physical, screaming, undeniable fact, and your entire understanding of your own life rearranges itself in real time, whether you feel prepared for it or not. The film exaggerates this into a full-blown surreal set piece, but the emotional kernel at the center of it is painfully, recognizably honest. Now let's circle back to Alvy's first major display of power inside the house, because there's a structural choice worth pointing out that I think gets overlooked. The film doesn't show us Alvy's powers gradually, in small, easily digestible increments. It withholds, lets a little time pass, lets the audience settle into thinking maybe this is going to be a more grounded story than the premise suggested, and then it hits you all at once with an overwhelming, room-filling demonstration of exactly what this child can do. That's a deliberate pacing choice, and it mirrors something true about parenting itself. You don't get gradual, well-organized warnings about how much your life is about to change. You get glimpses, false calm, and then, all at once, a moment where the scale of what you're actually dealing with becomes undeniable, and there's no possible way to pretend otherwise anymore. Tim's reaction in that scene, the way his face moves through disbelief, then denial, then something close to genuine horror, then, almost immediately after, a flicker of something that looks suspiciously like wonder, is honestly one of Jamie Kennedy's better moments of physical performance in the entire film. He's reacting to nothing, technically, an empty space where visual effects will later be inserted, and yet the emotional truth of watching a parent realize their child is genuinely extraordinary, in the most literal and overwhelming sense of that word, comes through clearly enough to land. Let's talk a little more about Otto, Tim's boss, because that character does more thematic work than his screen time might initially suggest. Otto isn't simply an obstacle, a generic demanding, boss archetype dropped into the story to create stakes at the office. He represents an entire value system that the film is quietly arguing against throughout its runtime, the idea that total, undivided focus on professional output is the only acceptable measure of a person's worth. Otto has no patience for Tim's exhaustion, no curiosity about what's happening in his personal life, no flexibility whatsoever for the idea that a person might be going through something that temporarily, understandably, affects their performance. In a strange way, Otto is almost a mirror image of Loki, just operating in the mundane, unglamorous world of corporate deadlines instead of cosmic mythology. Both characters want something specific from Tim and don't particularly care what it costs him personally to provide it. Both represent forces that view Tim primarily as a means to an end, a deliverable, a vessel, rather than as a whole person navigating something difficult. The film never draws this parallel explicitly, never has a character pointed out in dialogue, but it's there in the structure if you're paying attention, and it adds a quiet thematic coherence to a film that otherwise can feel scattered scene to scene. Let's also go a little deeper on the dynamic between Otis and Alvy, because there's an emotional turn late in that relationship worth highlighting. For most of the film, Otis is positioned as a victim, a long, suffering, jealous pet getting repeatedly tormented by a rival he never asked for and can't begin to understand. But there's a shift that happens gradually, almost without the film announcing it, where Otis starts to become something closer to a protector. By the film's climax, when real danger enters the house in the form of Loki's true intentions, Otis isn't thinking about rivalry anymore. He's thinking about defending the family unit, including the very baby who spent the entire film making his life miserable. That's a small but genuinely affecting arc, and it works because it mirrors something true about how sibling relationships, and pet, and baby relationships, actually evolve over time. The annoyance, the jealousy, the resentment over displaced attention, all of that can coexist with a deeper, more fundamental loyalty that surfaces the moment real danger appears. Otis spends 90 minutes being tortured by Alvy's chaos and still, when it matters most, throws himself into the fight on the baby's behalf without hesitation. The film earns that turn better than it earns several of its more prominent human emotional beats, frankly, and it's worth giving credit where it's due. Now, let's spend a little more time inside the Loki material, because there's psychological nuance there that's easy to miss if you're only watching for the slapstick. What makes Loki compelling, when the film lets him be compelling, isn't just that he's a god with selfish motives. It's that his selfishness comes from a place of genuine, long, simmering grievance. He didn't choose exile. He was cast out by his own father for behavior that, in the grand scheme of cosmic mischief, seems almost petty compared to the scale of punishment he received. Centuries of being denied a home, denied belonging, denied the simple dignity of being wanted by his own family, will curdle almost anyone's character, even a god's. So when Loki looks at Alvy and sees nothing but a vessel, a means of finally getting home, there's a dark mirror happening there too. Tim is afraid of failing his son. Loki is the living result of a father who, in his own way, failed him, and never looked back to fix it. The film doesn't spell this out directly, doesn't give Loki some heartfelt monologue connecting his exile to Tim's anxieties about fatherhood, but the architecture is there for anyone willing to read it that way. Two father-son relationships, one beginning, fragile, full of fear and possibility, and one long broken beyond repair, sit on opposite ends of this story, and the film's climax is essentially a battle to determine which kind of ending Alvy is going to get. Let's also take a longer look at the climax itself, because there's more going on structurally than a simple battle between good and evil. When Tim finally confronts Loki directly, the film doesn't give him brute strength or any kind of conventional physical advantage. He's an ordinary man going up against a literal god. What he has instead is intimate, specific knowledge of his own son, an understanding built not through magic but through the exhausting, mundane work of actually showing up and paying attention during all those chaotic weeks beforehand. Tim knows what makes Alvy laugh. He knows what calms him down. He knows, on some instinctive level, how Alvy's imagination works, because he spent his entire career thinking in exactly that kind of exaggerated, playful, consequence-free visual language. That knowledge becomes the actual weapon in the final confrontation, far more than any physical action ever does. Tim isn't out muscling a god. He's out, imagining him, using the specific, hard-won understanding of his own child to outmaneuver someone who sees that same child as nothing more than raw material. It's a satisfying piece of storytelling logic, even if the visual execution around it is, as we've discussed, often more chaotic than elegant. The idea underneath it holds up. The parent who actually pays attention will always have an advantage that pure power can never replicate. And when Odin finally steps in, restoring order, there's a quiet detail worth noting in how that resolution is staged. Odin isn't framed as a savior swooping in to fix everything Tim couldn't handle himself. He's framed more as a witness, someone who arrives only after Tim has already proven, through his own actions, that he understands what's at stake and is willing to fight for it. The cosmic authority figure doesn't do the emotional work of the climax. He simply confirms that the emotional work has already been done by the people who actually needed to do it. That's a subtle but important distinction, and it keeps the ending from feeling like a deus ex machina in the most deflating sense of that term. The gods don't save this family. The Father does. The gods just make sure the rules of the universe catch up to that fact afterward. Let's also revisit the film's quiet final scene one more time, because there's something worth sitting with in just how ordinary it chooses to be. After everything, after Norse gods and CGI infants and a marriage nearly torn apart by secrets, the film ends on Tim simply being present. Not triumphant. Not heroic in any grand, sweeping sense. Just present, in the room, with his wife and his son, doing the unglamorous, repetitive, exhausting work of actually being a parent on an ordinary afternoon with nothing dramatic happening at all. That's the real ending the entire film has been building toward, underneath all the noise. Not a defeat of evil. Not a cosmic resolution. Just a man who used to be terrified of this exact moment, finally able to sit inside it without flinching. It's a small note to end on, almost anticlimactic if you're grading purely on spectacle, but emotionally, it's the only ending that actually makes sense for the story this film was quietly telling the entire time, underneath the green-faced chaos and the mythological detours and the relentless, exhausting slapstick. So when people ask why a movie this messy, this critically savaged, this widely mocked for its CGI baby, still gets brought up in conversation more than 20 years after it disappeared from theaters, I think the honest answer is that it accidentally, almost despite itself, told a true story. Underneath the costume of a failed studio sequel, there's a sincere, recognizable account of what it actually feels like to become a parent before you feel ready, to watch your own carefully constructed sense of control dissolve in real time, and to discover, somewhere in the wreckage, that you were capable of more than you ever gave yourself credit for. That's worth something. Even wrapped in rubber-faced slapstick and a budget that didn't always match its ambition, that's worth something real. If this breakdown gave you a new appreciation, or at the very least a new understanding, of one of the strangest sequels in studio comedy history, let me know in the comments which exact scene haunted you the most. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more strange, fascinating stories left to tell.